Jane. Thank you, Irem. Thank you, sisters, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to have the possibility to share the experience of the metal workers here in Italy that we run in the last 3 years. Actually, everything, I wouldn't say that had started, but it has increased this project in 2021, where we were able in our national collective agreement to double the leave, the paid leave, which is provided by Italian law for women who are victims of violence, beside the fact which is or of the fact that the violence is inside or outside the working place. They have right to 3 months, and we enlarged to 6 months of paid leave. In that occasion, we started to work because we have a national committee where all the 3 major organization, trade union organization who signed the national collective agreement are represented together with the employers. First of all, I have to say that was very important was to recognize ourselves in the relation between women, because there were also, beside the fact that they are in different positions and representing different interesting other women on the other side of the table. So we started to discuss together. We promoted seminars and materials, but then we said that we needed to do something more. And we launched this project, which is called, Generate Culture, which the aim of the project was at least to organize in each and every working place in which we are organized as trade unions, or in which the companies, it's also sensitive on this issue, at least a moment of trainings for the workers, starting from the fact that in our sector, so which is mainly not everywhere, but mainly, if I look at the steel companies or automotive, we have a lot of predominance of male workers. And so we said we need to use 2 aspects, have at least 1 hour, 2 hours of trainings each year on the issues of violence, beside the fact which is that they could be inside or outside the working place, to promote a different kind of culture. And the idea was to connect locally the person, the association, the institutions who are working aside women to combat the violence against women. So the idea was double, to have both training and both to let know what are the association, the networks, the refugees that are present in the different territories. So to let them enter into the working place, let them directly speak to the workers and let to them explain what kind of problem they are facing every day. This was important to us, as I say, to establish a network locally, but also to raise awareness also inside our collective bargaining round, because now that we are now entering into the new negotiation, we are, of course, now on strike because on the salary we are very far away from finding a compromise. But we have to say that this common experience engaging together against violence has bring more awareness to the table, also on the subject of equal opportunities. So hopefully that will give also better result in that field for the future. So for us, this bring as a result hundreds of training hours that have been run all over the countries. It's a project we haven't stopped. We use it at the beginning. We launched it last November to avoid that companies, even, in good faith, but they use that date of the 25th of November to make pinkwashing. We wanted to do something serious and useful in that sense. And we found, have to say, an alliance that was going behind the fact and the roles that every one of us had around the table, with the common aim to try to do our best in each and every place in which we are able to enter, to promote a new culture of relation in between men and women inside the working place, but also outside the working place, so that women or men who are in that working place, who know who is around them, or they need help, or they know someone who need help, they know where to go. So was the first aim that we had, and we are now continuing because of course it's a long-lasting process. So thank you very much for giving the opportunity to tell you what we are trying to do here.
Thanks so much, Valentina. I'm always inspired by the work of the Italian trade unions. You always shift the dial on what is possible. So it's great to see, particularly in those male-dominated sectors, this work taking place. Okay, our next panelist is still having some difficulty joining, so hopefully that's Rita Goit, who's from Nigeria, and she's still having some difficulties joining, so hopefully she'll come in later. And I'll move on to our next panelist, who is from Australia, and this is Will Stracht, who is Assistant Secretary of the Victoria Trades Hall Council in Australia. And one of the things, again, we've always been inspired by the Australian unions. You really particularly led the world in getting the issue of domestic violence on the agenda. And we're very impressed with all of the kind of precedents you set for the rest of us on that. But most recently, the Australian unions have been really active in lobbying and campaigning for some really important legislative reforms to end violence and harassment in the world of work. And there's been some really important changes in the last couple of years, including, the legal universal entitlement of all workers to paid domestic violence leave, and a new positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment and sexual discrimination, amongst others, in the workplace. So we're really interested to hear more about this. Obviously, this comes also from ratification of Convention 190, which was an additional lever, I think, in Australia. But also the unions have been incredibly active on these issues. So we'd be interested, to give us some insights in some of these important changes and the strategies and the tactics that you used in the Australian unions to achieve them. Over to you, Will. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And I will start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here. That's the Wurundjeri people of the mighty Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any First Nations comrades who have joined us here, in my case tonight, but in other cases this morning. I'm really proud to be talking on behalf of the Australian Trade Union Movement about what are really some of the most significant changes in employment laws that we've seen in decades. And some of those other things that you've talked about. But the way we think about them really is there are three sets of changes. One is new protections for workers, and that's things like what you've talked about. So that positive duty on employers now to prevent sexual harassment. It's also that paid family and domestic violence leave, which applies to all employees, including casual employees here. And that's important because we know that women are more likely to be in casual and insecure forms of employment. And as well as that, we've pushed out this idea of sexual harassment and gender-based violence being occupational health and safety issues, which has given us new options in terms of protections under law. And then the second set of things that we've done is we've expanded out the options for workers where those protections fail. So historically, the way these things have been approached is that individual workers have to pursue matters through an Equal Opportunity Commission, whereas now we have potential to take these to the Employment Tribunal, which allows us to do collective matters, which, as we know, means that victims are much more likely to raise issues of sexual harassment where that's the case. And also, because we've expanded out the use of the occupational health and safety laws, it meant that our regulators now in that space are beginning to do prosecutions of employers. So we've had our first successful prosecution of an employer and the directors of a company that failed to take action where there was sexual harassment of a group of young workers in a hospitality organisation, and they were prosecuted under occupational health and safety law rather than purely through discrimination law. And that use of the occupational health and safety framework has also meant we've been able to do things like train our health and safety reps. We now have They get paid time off now to do training on the identification and prevention of gender-based violence. And then the last thing that kind of the way we've thought about this is there's, as you've talked about, that piece around prevention and the key drivers of gender-based violence against women, which are cultures of unequal power and cultures of silence. And so there's been this raft of changes that have been introduced, which are about addressing women's inequality in the workplace. So gender equality is now a kind of object, has finally been introduced as an object of our primary employment law here, which is an act that covers employment across the country. And so what that's meant is that our tribunal has now taken a gender lens to a whole range of issues that historically it never did, like the minimum wage decisions and things like that. So what that's meant is that we are now doing a whole range of things that are about addressing gender inequality in workplaces. And as well as that, there are things that are about addressing cultures of silence. So things around pay transparency, things around reporting to a government body that looks at, for instance, the gender pay gap. The reporting for that historically has been aggregated, but now individual employers can be identified where there is a large gender pay gap, which means we as trade unions can start to do something at the worst offenders. And we're starting to campaign around the banning of non-disclosure agreements in the settlement of sexual harassment matters. And we here in Victoria are very proud. Our government in Victoria has announced that it's going to implement measures. It's going to introduce a law to ban the misuse of non-disclosure agreements in sexual harassment matters so that victims aren't silenced. And that allows us as unions to do a whole lot more in that space of addressing sexual harassment, because if we don't know about it, then there's not a lot we can do. Whereas now victims are going to be able to talk about their experiences. So these are all things that we've done. Generally, we do these through a range of things. We've done it through enterprise bargaining. That's how I was there when the very first family and domestic violence leave clause was introduced at a very small employer out in the region here in Victoria, and that's now spread across the entire country, originally through enterprise bargaining, then through lobbying politicians, and that's largely engaged women unionists in that process, lobbying decision makers, and campaigning out in communities as well, doing petitions and talking to communities about why this is important, and building relationships with civil society. So as a result of all of that work, we've had massive changes. We are bedding those down, and we are very optimistic. Our gender pay gap is now, this year, it's the smallest it's ever been. We've had already a significant change there, and we think that more is going to happen. So we're very excited in Australia to see what happens next.
Fantastic, Will. That's really exciting to hear all of these developments. And I mean, we can maybe discuss this later, but as we go through the webinar, one of the things that really strikes me is that, all of these issues are so interconnected. So when we look at the gender pay gap, we need to also recognise that women who experience gender-based violence are less likely, the limited research evidence that's available suggests that, they're less likely to progress in their careers, they're more likely to work part-time or low-paid work, and indeed to leave their jobs, particularly if the violence is quite serious. So I think it's really good to make those connections, and also really inspired by the work that's happening on occupational safety and health and bringing violence and harassment into this area. So it's really great to hear of these developments. Okay, thanks very much, Will. And we're going to move on to our next panelists from the other side of the world, in Nepal. And I want to introduce Smriti Lama, who is the Secretary for International Relations in her union GBVH. And GBVH has been running a campaign with partners in Nepal for the ratification of Convention 190. And the unions have been really active over the last number of years in this. And the campaign really, I think that's why we wanted really to hear about your initiative, because it really focuses on the importance of women's leadership and participation in trade unions. And one thing that we've seen across the world the campaign for C190 has been successful where women take the leadership roles and particularly, speak with their own intersectional voices as well around that. So we'd be really interested to hear from you about the link between, women's active participation and leadership in the unions and the elimination of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, and what your union is trying to do to address this. So over to you, Srinti. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jen, Sister Irene, and all the brothers and sisters, comrade. Very namaste and good evening from Nepal. I'm Smriti here, representing GFUN, one of the largest trade union of Nepal. So it's my honor to share this panel on very specific agenda of GBVH, which has been always the significant issue within a Nepali labor market. It's been in Nepali there is, while talking about gender-based violence and harassment, in Nepali there is a one code, more you jhan bujyo jhan kathin. It means more you understand, more it became more complicated, in our part of the world. As I heard two of the comrades who share the issues of, this gender-based violence and harassment issues. Likewise, in Nepal also, we are facing lots of challenges in the world of work. If you see the nature of exploitation evolve over the time, we can see what once in the role of the foster mother to now it's transferred to the surrogate mother. You see the evolvedness is something differently, and then it's a corresponding also different forms of violence in every era. So we can see what kind of the violence in the world of work we can see. As a general women and then working women, it is a quite different harassment and violence that we have been facing, that the Sister Irene already shared, and 1 in 3 the women who have been facing. Just such like we have also same. If you see the Nepali labor market, there is about 51% women are in labor force, but most of them are much informal economy, and then they have been facing lots of challenges, which has been included physical violence to the, emotional abuse, economic violence, that we can include the pay gap, and then nature of the unsafe workplace is another one. Discrimination and structural violence. Cyber violence is now emerging for the young, new upcoming young women who have been coming in the, world of work. Third-party violence is also one area where working women have been facing these challenges. And the exploitation, as I have mentioned, it's been also evolved by the time, that we can just physical violence to the cyber violence, that we need to address the challenges. How to bring more young women in the labor market is one of another challenge that we have been facing. By being trade unions, and then we have been active participations in the labor market. As my organizations, when it forms before 3 decades back, it was 0% representation of the women in the leadership. Now we are 40%. This is how we achieve the step by step toward the gender equality, because we believe that bringing change in the policies is not the way. It should implement well. If you see the Nepali labor law, it's reformed well, just like there is a maternity leave provisions, 14 weeks, including 60 days paid, and then 15 days paid maternity for the care leave for the husband of the wife. So you see that there are several changes that we made it in the labor market as well as the labor law also, but still we are facing lots of things. Of the part of implementation is another nut to crack. That's why what we feel is that the mindset is one of the key areas we need to work on. Having policy is always difficult, but part of implementation is one another, where the mindset should change. For in the world of work, your partner, your co-partners, your male counterpartner has to be accept yourself, women partner, as the equal. There should be equal trade it will change, that we found. We have several changes in the policies, workplace violence and harassment also we did it, and then several campaigns going on for the ratification 190 is also going on, that we have been working on. But the challenges that we found is the mindset which has to be changed within labor market, within leadership. For that, we have been initiative different way. The women's leadership is not the strategy. It should essential to eliminate the gender-based violence and harassment. This is a part of access and the control. Access is now we made it, but the how we can make more control to bring more women in the labor market, to bring them in the labor force. I mean, like a trade union for make them member and bring them in the leadership. So there are steps. So we just for number is a power, few but the stable, slow but the steady. That was the first slogan that we made it when we were a 0%. And then up to now, the top 100 cadre is one of the key areas that we work within an informal economy or the formal economy. So we try to bring the top 100 cadres women. From that now, whoever in the leadership, from that 100 cadres women are now in the leadership, and not mere representation, but equal participation is another key area that we work on, how to bring equal participation of the women. And another one to the grassroots women is we just formed the policy within a GFON that 25% women in all program of the GFON. There should be ensure 25 before. Now it is already 1/3 participation. Every program, there should be 1/3 participation of the women, which will help us to develop the leadership. They can be a part of the all activities of the trade union. And 1/3 male participation in every women focus program, like women seminars or something for like that. We have ensured 1/3 representation of male to internalize what it means to be a minority. So our male counterpart or leaders who can understand what exactly the minority means. So these are some very key the policies which has been adopted by GFON. Work-life balance is another one key areas that we have been working to bring the more gender-friendly, wall of work in Nepali labor market, because we believe we should bring more women in the leadership, more women in the union fold to at least speak out what exactly the harassment they have been facing. Unions should adopt the gender-based violence and harassment issues as its core issue of the trade union. So we have been, raising the awareness to bring this all part as in the 190 that we have been policy advocacy going on in 3 part, like awareness raising within a trade union and the stakeholders to bring more, to create the more pressures. And another one is the policy advocacy within a ministry or the policy makers. There are several interaction has been taking place to adopt or to ratify one's Convention 190, and then of course the 206 that we have been working on it. So side by side we are working in the awareness training as well as the policy intervention also. So this is what we have been working on it. If anything, then we will be happy to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tinti. You're doing some fantastic work, and it's really multifaceted, I think, the work that you're doing. But really, at the base of this is the fact that you've managed to get 40% women into leadership positions, and that is a major achievement. And that you've been able to build on that through policy change, through developing, an agenda for women's empowerment, for maternity, for work-life balance, and linking all of that to gender-based violence as well. So it's great work. We will hear from you again because we'll be doing a quick fire second round of the panel. I'm going to quickly move on now to our next participant, who is Jane Thomason, who is from the USA. And Jane, we're particularly grateful to have you here because it is now about 3:30 in the morning, I think, in the USA. So we're really grateful that you stayed up for this event. And I hope it's not too exhausting for you. Jane is a lead industrial hygienist in the National Nurses United Union, which has been, over the years, particularly during COVID, was really, really inspiring in the work that you did around the whole issue of the risks faced by COVID for nurses and and particularly migrant nurses as well. But also, the difficulties that healthcare workers faced of violence and harassment from third parties, such as parents and families, patients and families, excuse me. However, your union has been really proactive in introducing a whole variety of actions to help assess risks and prevent violence and harassment across US health facilities. And again, is another example of using occupational safety and health, building in risk assessment prevention around this important issue. So we'd be really happy to hear from you if you could share your experiences of what kind of tactics, strategies you used amongst unionized nursing workplaces to tackle violence and harassment in the world of work. Over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here with you. Worth getting up in the middle of the night for this conversation. And I think you're exactly right, Jane, that nurses and other healthcare workers in the United States have really seen rates of workplace violence rise over the past several decades, but most significantly since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And this is in no small part because healthcare employers are continuing to implement profit-motivated changes to staffing, workflows, patient care. And employers have really seized on the pandemic as an excuse to accelerate a lot of those changes. But the good news is that union nurses have a lot of experience fighting employers' schemes and winning. And workplace violence and safety are, of course, no exception to that. So every day, NNU's members are tackling workplace violence issues in their facilities, from winning strong language and collective bargaining agreements to organizing fight back campaigns in their facilities. Nurses have won measures like removing their last names from their name badges, improved de-escalation training, maintenance of broken alarm systems, improved staffing, behavioral emergency response teams, patient violence risk assessments and other chart flagging systems, and many other measures, which of course improve safety, not just for staff, but also for their patients as well. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk in more detail about some additional concrete wins achieved by one of NNU's state affiliates, the California Nurses Association, or CNA. Because those wins have really boosted nurses' campaigns to win protections around this issue. So back in 2010, a CNA member, Cynthia Palomata, actually died from a preventable workplace violence incident while working in a jail facility, providing medical care to people who were incarcerated. And her death really galvanized the union to fight for enforceable mandates on employers to prevent workplace violence and to respond to nurses' concerns about safety in their workplace. I think CNA's campaign was really successful because it engaged the membership. So nurses turned out in really significant numbers to hearings. They took action at their facilities. They spoke to media. And one of the, I think, important things that nurses did was they told their stories. Something that can be very hard to do, I think, as everyone on this call knows, something that can be very hard to do when it comes to workplace violence, to relive that incident and the trauma that it causes. But nurses, they recognized the fact that policymakers needed to understand what nurses were facing on a daily basis. And nurses also recognized that their expertise was key in shaping what was going to be effective protection. And so these efforts, they resulted in a landmark standard that created robust requirements for healthcare employers in the state of California to implement workplace violence prevention plans for their facilities. And I think there's some key requirements of this standard. I'll highlight a couple. There's more details on NNU's website, but just to highlight a few that I think are of particular interest for this conversation. So the standard requires in California that workplace violence prevention plans have to be created with input from direct care nurses and other staff. I think that's key because those direct care staff have essential insights into what prevention measures will be effective, and they're not routinely engaged by employers when employers are putting together these plans. Another requirement is that employers have to track and report violent incidents, which provides us transparency on what's happening. Employers are also required to encourage employees to report the issue. And that's important because so many employers have really downplayed workplace violence and tried to push nurses to treat it as part of the job, which is, of course, unacceptable. And the standard also requires employers to implement prevention measures. Things like improving the physical safety of workplaces, providing safe staffing, ensuring that there are sufficient trained staff available to respond to incidents. And this includes responding to nurses' concerns about workplace violence and their suggestions for prevention. And so once the standard went into effect in 2018, CNA members, of course, didn't stop their organizing efforts, knowing that employers wouldn't follow the standard voluntarily. And so our members launched a robust enforcement program. The union rolled out training for members so that they would know their rights under the new standard. Union leaders coordinated efforts to put demands on employers to comply with the new standards and then escalated with collective action when compliance was delayed. And I think those efforts have really resulted in material improvements in safety in healthcare facilities across the state of California. And just very, very briefly to share one concrete example of a fight back campaign from the University of California, San Diego Medical Center. Union nurses had been organizing around workplace violence prevention and enforcing the standard for several years when an active shooter incident occurred. This resulted in poor communication and mass confusion at the facility. Many staff were very understandably very, very, very scared. Fortunately, it was a false alarm, but it did highlight the poor state of security arrangements, which nurses had been telling management about for years. Shortly after the incident, nurses spoke up again. A group of CNA nurse representatives and other union members went to the hospital executive suite. They spoke to the chief nursing officer, delivered a petition demanding improvements and protections around workplace violence. The employer agreed to implement multiple demands from the nurses, including instituting weapons screening at all hospital entrances, providing additional security rounding, and improving emergency alert communications, and several more improvements. So I think really having legal mandates like the California standard can support nurses in making those demands and enhance their campaigns to win protections. And that is, of course, why NNU is fighting for a national standard based on the California model, which would apply to every state in our nation. And we've made significant progress in that campaign, winning very strong bipartisan support amidst a very turbulent climate here in the US. And even with the incoming very anti-worker administration that we're facing down, our fight for protections will not slow down. It will not stop. Because the reality is that wins like the ones that I've been talking about are always possible when union nurses organize and take collective action. Every day, nurses are standing up for what is right and just, what is needed for them and their patients to be safe. And of course, they won't stop until everyone is safe and is able to receive safe healthcare. So that's a little bit about what we are facing down and what our members are winning. So I'll turn it back to you, Jane. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jane. You wouldn't believe it was 3:30 in the morning. That was so clear and really inspiring. And I think, we're all interested to see a copy of the standard, actually, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the standard has been so important in setting kind of the backdrop, really, to allow unions to campaign. And in the wider context of Convention 190 as well, and indeed laws being passed, these are really crucial to give or to open the door, to give the leverage really for these really important developments to take place. So it's very exciting to see the effectiveness of the campaign in California, and we hope that it does extend across the whole of the United States, particularly in the current political climate as well. So thanks so much for that. We're going to go on to our final speaker now, and this is Carol Sheffer, who is both a national union officer from her union, the Communication Workers Union, and she's led many inspiring collective agreements and initiatives in her union around domestic violence as a workplace issue, around sexual harassment and so on. But Carol is also the Uni Europa's women's president, and also Uni World is part of the Uni World Executive Board. And in August last year, she was elected the position of Uni World Women's President. So we're delighted to see you in that role, Carol. Uni Europa last year signed a European level cross-sectoral guidelines covering sectors such as telecommunications, finance and gaming. And the guidelines were negotiated with the respective employers at the European level. And one of the things that was really kind of inspiring about getting these agreements with the employers was that you covered all forms of violence and harassment. So you looked at, third-party violence and harassment, internal violence and harassment, domestic violence, all of those forms. So we're really interested to hear from you specifically about the European level cross-sectoral guidelines, what their key features are, but also how Uni Europa is now working to implement the guidelines so that they actually have a real impact. And, if there has been any impact so far, any positive examples on the ground as a result. So over to you, Carol. Thanks so much for being here today, especially because you're also across the other side of the world in Argentina, away from home.
Yes, thank you so much, Jane, for that lovely introduction. And yeah, I was on the steering committee for the project, and I'm actually filling in today for Amel Dijmel, who's the Equal Opportunities Director for Uni. So I hope I can do the project justice because Amel was not available today. But I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak. And so far, it has been really, really fascinating listening to the examples from the other countries and the crossover that we have between us in relation to the work that we're trying to do. So just to say a little bit about the project that Jane just highlighted, with the support of the European Commission, we delivered a 2-year cross-sectoral social dialogue project, and that was entitled Eliminating Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. And the project was steered jointly between Uni Europa and employer organizations. And because it was so broad and because we had engaged with the social partners and the employers in the process, as well as the European Trade Union kind of Confederation, it was quite groundbreaking and really one of a kind as such. And as Jane pointed out, the action did focus on 3 priorities. One was third-party violence, the ratification process of the ILO Convention, tackling domestic violence, with home being the new workplace. And as part of that process, we also did a very broad mental health survey, and that was conducted by external experts. And I will highlight a little bit about that later. But as Jane pointed out, it was cross-sectoral. So this was a case of where we included the uni sectors in commerce, gaming, ICTS, which is my sector, graphic and design, finance, care, and we're broadening it out. And the employers that we worked with at the time were Partouche, Amice, and we also had ECNO, which again it would have been one of the organizations that I worked with. And ECNO is the European Telecommunications Networks Operators Association. But I'm pleased to say, even though the project was finalized in February of 2024 this year, we also on the 11th of April had a new company come on board, a Spanish company, Orange Group, which also signed the cross-sectoral guidelines, and they are a casino gaming company based in Latin America. So they're in the gaming sector, and they also signed the guidelines. So just to say about the guidelines, they're a result of extensive documentary research and an EU-wide survey among trade unions and employers, and consultations with the members of the reference sectors. So to get those consultations up and running, the project partners engaged in webinars, workshops, and interactive sessions where we had a significant number of participants. And as I say, the project activities included the 6 sector-specific roundtables, 3 webinars, and then 1 conference gathering the key actors, which would be the EU Parliament, the Commission, ILO, and independent experts. So in relation to the roundtables, for example, one was the finance sector. It was done in Rome. The graphical sector was in Madrid, commerce sector in Lisbon, the ICTS, which was held in Dublin, and then the gaming sector was held in Malta. So how we roll this out, really, how can we make these guidelines be effective for trade unions? And a lot of consideration was given to this, of course. And really what we want to do is train and inform workers and their representatives on the mechanisms available to prevent violence and harassment in the world of work. We want to encourage all the affiliated unions to address the matter through collective bargaining, particularly in relation to the prevention and elimination of third-party violence negotiations. And you know, I was interested in what was being said earlier on, I think, by Will in relation to the use of non-disclosure, excuse me, non-disclosure agreements. This is also something that we're working on in Ireland to get rid of the non-disclosure agreements and to implement legislation to ban them. Excuse me. I have a bit of a sore throat, apologies. So really, we also want to address the issue of economic violence, because overall, there needs to be a good understanding that violence is just not physical violence, that it takes many, many forms, as was highlighted by previous speakers. So we want to address the issue of economic violence through campaigns to end the gender pay gap and also the gender pensions gap, which is quite significant too. So I mentioned earlier on that there was a mental health survey carried out, and that happened between October of 2022 and September of 2023. And overall, we had 228 trade unions participate, and 18 employer member organizations also responded to the survey. So it was interesting to compare and contrast the views of the trade unions in relation to the mental health survey with the views of the employers. So, as I say, the survey itself was carried out by external consultants, and it was aimed at trade unions and employers who are involved in preventing gender-based violence and harassment, domestic violence impacting the workplace, and of course, third-party violence. So what I will do is I will share the landing page with the group, and then you will be able to see the survey that was conducted and all of the guidelines and the supporting documentation that was there. So to conclude the process, what we had was a final conference that was actually held in Paris in December. Sorry, I said February. It was December of 2023. And we had a 2-day plenary meeting. And on the first day, the project steering group presented the project activities and the results. It was obviously attended by all the participating employers. And then on the second day, the cross-sectoral guidelines were officially signed and published. So we had 60 participants on that day, and it really was very, very successful. And all of that, again, has been published. And what really was interesting, I think, coming from this is that there's now a very, very strong bipartisan call for an EU directive on psychosocial risks. And that did emerge from the survey, 91% calling for this to mitigate psychosocial risks. So I think that's going to be a significant piece going forward. What this means for trade unions in general. Well, I think coming from the guidelines and how we can implement them properly is to demand that governments create mechanisms to prevent and combat violence against women. And I think the non-disclosure agreements are going to be quite important. I was listening earlier on to the first speaker from Italy who said that, you know, you have legislative leave for domestic violence, and we've negotiated those as well. In Ireland, we have twice, with some of the employers that I work with, we managed to negotiate twice the amount, but we were able to use the guidelines then to revamp any existing policies where the legislation hadn't been prior to the legislation being implemented. The other thing is that, excuse me, we want measures that would seek to protect women from all forms of violence, whether it's physical, mental, moral, or monetary. Demand that companies include the issue of all discussions in relation to violence pertaining to the health and safety of workers and equal opportunities. Likewise, companies must provide counselling. We think this is really, really important for people suffering from violence, to help them break the circle of fear and to be in a position to denounce their aggressors, because unless you have those supports, it's very, very difficult, I think, to make a claim. And the other thing as well, of course, is to ensure that the issue of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, harassment and sexual harassment, and homophobia are constant themes in all discussions of gender. So we really want to make sure that this is on the collective bargaining agenda as much as possible, and it's got such a strong focus. But for us in my own union, the biggest thing I think that was coming from the project as well is the need to train and retrain our union representatives. So we are currently involved in that process. What we are doing is developing a toolkit for members so that they can know how to identify sexual harassment and violence, because sometimes that really is an issue. There's an assumption that unless it's physical, that it's not a form of violence, and we feel that there really is a need to put a strong focus on that. So we're developing guidelines for our representatives. We're also in the process of developing, as I say, a toolkit for members, being able to assist them to address the issues, identify the issues, and make complaints. And I don't think we would have been able to do that unless those guidelines were in place. So it was a very, very successful project. And I think mostly because we had so many employers involved, and that cross-sectoral process was really, really important to get them across the line. So yeah, thank you, Jane. I think that's pretty much it for me for now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carol. I really urge you to have a look at the separate agreements, but also the cross-sectoral guidelines, because they do kind of encapsulate everything that is included in Convention 190, and I think it gives a really good model actually for bargaining and negotiation, because that's, I suppose, what the trade unions have been doing, is what's reflected in the ITUC's report this year, that, even in situations where, unions are working in countries where they haven't so far ratified Convention 190, it still provides a really excellent framework for bargaining. And I think that's where some of our most inspiring stories have come from the trade unions, actually, of using this framework, regardless of ratification or not. And the fact that the convention puts a responsibility on the employers to develop workplace policies, risk assessment, so that including psychosocial risks, Carol, I'm glad you mentioned that, and also, the necessity to train and inform workers about those risks and involve them in resolving them and mitigating them. So these are all really important issues. I'm afraid we still haven't been able to connect with Rita, which is a real shame. I might just say a couple of words about what the work that Rita has been involved in, because it's really inspiring. Rita is with the Nigerian Labour Congress, which has been, working, very, very strong campaign around ratification of Convention 190. It looks like the Nigerian government is, very close to ratification, thanks to the union campaigns. But this particular project has really focused on one of the most challenging environments in Nigeria for working women in the informal economy, and that is women who work as market traders. And in Nigeria, there are huge markets, largely women working in them. And there's been very high levels of violence, sexual harassment on a regular basis against the women market traders. And, the Nigerian Labour Congress has made it a priority to organise informal workers. And it's a very, very good example about how the campaign for Convention 190 has also been used as a tool for organising and recruiting women in some of the most precarious jobs. And they've done some really fantastic work in the markets in Lagos and a couple of other cities to organise the women traders, to develop protocols and codes of practice for the markets, to involve the men who work in the markets around prevention as well. So there's been some really, really fantastic experiences, I think, of how informal workers can organize, protect themselves, protect their children, because a lot of the market traders have their children with them, and the children, there are also issues around safeguarding and protecting the children. So maybe Rita will join us just at the very end, but I just wanted to mention the inspiring work that's being done in Nigeria on this issue. We're just going to do another quick round of questions for each speaker, and it's the same question for each speaker, and it's just a couple of minutes each. We'd really like you to share with us your reflections as to what you think are the one or two main challenges that you've faced in this work, and what do you think has been the ingredient for success by reflecting on the examples, that you have given us. And I think it's really important learning for unions who are developing their own strategies to be reflecting on what's worked well, what the challenges are, how you overcame those challenges. So Valentina, could we start with you? Just a couple of minutes on your reflections on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for the contribution. It was really a precious morning together, and or a night for some of you, so double thanks. I think one of the major challenges is, in the working places where there are no women delegates, then there it's challenging to raise the awareness to our colleagues, to make them responsible about the fact that they need to carry out this struggle, even if there are no women inside the trade unions there. So I'm not saying that they're not doing it. There are a lot of good examples of delegates, male, who are carrying out the initiatives. But I would say that this is one of these, and also, as I said before, avoiding initiatives of pinkwashing, because we do not need to do symbolic things, but things that are really effective. And what is really, I would say, empowered me in this experience, it's, I would say, sisterhood to me. The fact that we find a relation within women, the strength and the inspiration to go on and to enlarge our fight. So thank you.
It's wonderful, wonderfully inspiring sisterhood. And I mean, it's about women taking their power back, isn't it? So thank you, Valentina. That is brilliant. So next on to Will.
Hey, I agree with what Valentina said. I think that the critical difference for us in campaigning for national changes was identifying women activists to come on board from across the union movement, and then building up the capacity to do that work of lobbying and campaigning. So doing training around things like public speaking, dealing with objections, why these things were important, telling their personal stories, particularly victim survivors of things like sexual harassment. It's incredibly useful to persuade the decision makers to hear those stories, and we've seen the impact it can have of having workers who've experienced sexual harassment tell their stories, because sometimes those in power, politicians, even sympathetic politicians, think that if they change a law, miraculously everything is fixed. And so having workers who then say, well, sexual harassment has been illegal in this country for 40 years, and yet 1 in 5 workers has experienced it, 1 in 3 workers has experienced it in the last 5 years, and I'm one of those, has made the difference in persuading decision makers, in getting it up in bargaining, but also to get the stories out into the media. Because when you are trying to do large-scale changes to employment law, you have to have people who can tell that story, so that in the public debate about this, it's not abstract. So particularly things like sexual harassment and gender-based violence, because these are largely invisible, if we don't see the victims, then we don't see the crime. So having and training up activists for things like, we did Parliament Days where 60 women went and basically took over Parliament House and met with every politician in delegations to talk about why gender-based violence was important and addressing it was important. And in building their capacity to do that, we have built a stronger movement as well for change.
Inspiring stuff, Will. Fantastic. Let's go on to Smriti from
Yes.
your learning from your campaign in Nepal.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with both comrades that share. yeah, we need the really a holistic approach to overcome this gender-based violence in the workplace. It needed lots of efforts to do, as we have a lots of law, but still we are struggling to enforcement of those law. Actually, GIFON has been organizing in all informal workers and then the formal agriculture itself within a 23 different sector. We focus on more women-focused sectors like health volunteers and health workers, and street vendors in another one key focus for us. Domestic workers and home-based workers is another one focus of the sectors. Beauticians is another, and then agriculture and construction is a key areas and key affiliates of the GFONs within the 23 affiliates. We try to make them awareness about the speak out especially. So as I mentioned that the holistic approach need now 16 days, during this 16 days campaign going on, we have been awareness campaign on throughout the country within our, like we have a province level and then municipality level to engage more women in that. So awareness why it is necessary, why we have to, speak out. So that is ongoing. And on this 190, we had one research to see what are the law, what are the barriers to ratify it. So that also gave us the roadmap, what we have to do. Normally trend since 1 or 2 years that we have been doing this all 16 days campaign, we try to, mobilize our, grassroots level campaigns and an awareness campaign, and then it will run up to the 8 March. On 8 March, we want to give one big push to the political, political leadership, the government, as we have a 2-layer of the government, central government and then province government. We used to give the memorandum of understanding, MOUs to them, or sometimes the signature campaign, we used to submit that. So throughout that, we are just pushing this within a structure also. We tried to bring the, we did the gender audit within a GFON. So that gives us some step toward to push women leadership. And then we have a gender policy. In each, every and each committees, there should be 1/3 women leadership. Ensured, that should be ensured. And then we have a code of conduct also, gender-based violence. So we try to make them internalize within our structure and try to make it, influence in other trade union also, make it so we can make the one voice to put more pressures on the government to ratify 190. I think it's, the major challenge of that we are facing is that the within a the workforce, that the mindset as well, as we have a cultural and social barrier, which it's very difficult to overcome, that we are facing challenge. And then enforcement of the law is another key areas that we have been facing. And then now the major challenge to ratification part is the unstable government. We tried to push on. It is already in the pipeline for the Nepal, and the research also says Nepal and Bangladesh, Pakistan is the country who can ratify within our part of the world. In Nepal also we tried, and it's already in the pipeline, like 155 Convention 155, 102 of the Social Security, and like this, the 190 is also in the pipeline. We are trying our best to push this, so we hope that we can bring some good result on that. And this that we try to make it more push within a domestication of the things, that why it is necessary, that through the campaign we have been doing. So this is how we have been working within our trade union as well as the policymakers also. One very interesting campaign that we did it, that I would like to share. In an election that we said, in this election, who should women vote? We tried this campaign to bring awareness within a politician to address the women issues. So there are some good example that we have been trying throughout the campaign, which I would like to share here. So thank you, Jen, for this opportunity to sharing.
Thanks, Smriti. That is brilliant, inspiring stuff. Fantastic. Okay, pass the floor now to, or the virtual floor to Jane.
I think this is a really great question. And I think in the healthcare space, in our experience in terms of challenges, I think one of the biggest that nurses face is around the employer's narrative that workplace violence is just part of the job and nurses should just suck it up and deal with it. NNU did a big national study of workplace violence last year, and we found that about 1 in 6 nurses report that their employer actually discourages employees from reporting workplace violence incidents. And this can be a big hurdle to getting any kind of fight back campaign going. So it's often the first place that we need to start, right, in terms of raising awareness of what workplace violence is and how employers could be preventing it. I think another challenge is that it's what everyone else has been talking about, right? That enforcement is always ongoing. Even after you win new contract language or a new law, employers don't comply by themselves. And I think really those challenges are actually one side of the same coin as the main ingredient for success, and that's member engagement and collective action. And just making sure that when we're building a campaign on workplace violence, whether the goal is to win improvements in one unit or an entire facility or a whole contract or a new law, it all has to start with member engagement, making sure that nurses know the issue, have the opportunity to share their experiences, to engage their expertise in the campaign. Because as we've all been saying, right, when workers are able to act collectively, whether it's through a petition, a strike, a march on the boss, a press conference, testifying at hearings, right? That is how we make change. And so really that engagement, I think, is the key ingredient for success, right? So that's what I would share in response to that question. Thank you.
Brilliant, Jane. I think that really reinforces the importance of women's voices, of leadership, of bringing women to the table, whether it's as an activist, as a negotiator, a campaigner. That's fantastic. Okay, Carol, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I think one of the challenges that's really obvious in my union is that, you know, despite 30, 40 years of employment equality legislation and comprehensive policy work, on their own, they're not going to prevent sexual harassment and violence. And we really need to have some good practice measures backing that up. So one of the things for us is awareness, and education. And while, you know, a senior management level, there's a high level of awareness, it's the line managers and the middle managers that have to implement a lot of these policies. And it's the same for our trade union representatives. This is really where the education and the awareness is key. So for us, we're sort of at a stage that we're almost going back to the drawing board, which is interesting because we're taking a look at this and saying COVID has really changed an awful lot in relation to how we approach violence in the workplace. Convincing employers and trade union representatives, of course, that domestic violence is a workplace issue, getting a broad understanding as to how it spills into the workplace and how we have to protect the victims of domestic violence and also their co-workers who might be witnessing everything that's going on. So there's a huge level of awareness raising that needs to be built in to that process. And the other thing as well, I think that's really coming forward for us is the third-party violence. That seemed to have been really kind of pushed aside. You know, I think like the example that was given in the nursing sector, it's part of the job, it's something that you must put up with. That's absolutely cannot be the case. And it's the same, any you know, employee that has customer interfacing situations is going to be more prone to violence, and we need to make sure that those measures are in place to protect them. So that's really why my union, and we're working with the CWU in the UK as well, in relation to this, we've had these discussions and we've said there really is a lack of awareness as to what sexual harassment is, what third-party violence is, how domestic violence spills into the workplace, and how C190 can support us. So that's why we're sort of going back to the drawing board again after all the years of legislation, and we're saying, no, we really must do more. We must do more for the victims. We must do more for them to be able to come forward and feel comfortable in coming forward and not feel that they can't do that. We must do more to educate our representatives. And as I say, that's a body of work that we are, excuse me, doing at the moment, and we're hoping that we know that we will be implementing the guidelines as part of that process and developing our own policies and procedures. So yeah, I think that's really one of the big challenges for us is the awareness raising, the understanding, and making sure that we have really good practice measures to support any policy agreements that we do. Thanks, Jane.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Carol. And I'm delighted to see that Jordania has finally been able to get connected. Could I just give you the floor, Jordania, before I do my sum up? And we're so delighted that you were able to get here, even if it is very near the end of our webinar. So just over to you for a few words. Thank you.
Gracias, Jen, y de verdad gracias a todas las panelistas. Mis disculpas porque desde casi media hora antes de iniciar la actividad estuvimos tratando de resolver el problema de conexión y solo hace unos minutos pues lo logramos. Igual estuve escuchando como participante algunas intervenciones y yo solo quisiera desde la Confederación Sindical Internacional, desde la CCI, que ustedes saben que hemos hecho un trabajo intenso por la ratificación y la implementación, como lo decía una de las panelistas, de la importancia de la implementación, pues de avanzar y hemos estado muy al pendiente, impulsando la campaña y tratando de hacer estos intercambios de estas experiencias diversas en los diferentes países para ver qué funciona de este lado, que se pueda aplicar en otro lado y de verdad que agradecer mucho el trabajo, todos los esfuerzos que han estado haciendo y reiterar simplemente que desde la CCI vamos a continuar impulsando el activismo por la ratificación y la implementación del convenio 190. Gracias a todas las panelistas y muchas gracias por esta coordinación de la mesa, Jen, de verdad. Reiterarnos a las órdenes y solamente saludarles brevemente. Gracias.
Thanks, Jordania. I will pass over to you again after my summing up, but we're really glad to have you here. Just very briefly, because our time is going to be running out very soon. I just wanted to sum up with 5 main strategies that unions are using, can use, have been really, inspired by the kind of voices and leadership of women. So first of all is that we need to ensure safe spaces for reporting gender-based violence. That could be whether it's sexual harassment, third-party violence and harassment, or indeed domestic violence where it has a workplace impact. These are highly sensitive issues. I think on third-party violence and harassment, there's a lot more work now being done on this, and particularly how to address the gender-based nature of third-party violence and harassment. So that's the first part, creating the safe spaces so that we can report those violations of our human rights at work and have some resolution of them. Second is the issue of women's voices, leadership, and also the issues around culture change, of building the structural change needed to address the problem of gender-based violence and harassment. And I think we've heard some really good examples of women's activism, women's leadership, of women standing in their own power as activists, as negotiators. And we know that when women are present in those negotiations, when they're present in those campaigns, when women's voices are heard and seen, we know that change occurs. So that is really crucial. The third issue is related to I think what has come out very strongly from our presenters is the importance of prevention. We can have safe spaces for reporting, but we want to prevent sexual harassment, gender-based violence happening in the first place. So what do we need to do around prevention? And I think we've had some really nice examples from, Canada, from Italy, from US, of how to build the prevention of violence and harassment, particularly gender-based violence, into our occupational safety and health mechanisms. And from my mind, this is one of the most exciting elements of Convention 190, that we bring this issue into the centre of occupational safety and health, into our risk assessment, into our risk mitigation measures. Let's accept that gender-based violence and harassment is a workplace hazard, and we need to be addressing that in a risk-based framework as well. And I just briefly want to mention psychosocial risks, because this is in the convention. And these are the risks that arise from, for example, lone working, the risks that arise from not having a policy in place, the risks that arise where there is no trade union present in the workplace, or where trade unions are not recognised for their role. And it can also be situations related to the whole organisation of work and so on. And how we bring this into occupational safety and health is really important as well. And I was really encouraged to see the work that had happened in California around staffing levels, because that has been identified now as a very significant risk in relation to third-party violence and harassment. We've seen the sectoral approach as well as part of that through some of the examples that have been given from our panelists. The fourth issue is around the whole issue of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression, and how we have brought in the intersectional voices of women in the trade union movement around the risks, for example, faced by racialized workers, disabled women workers, and so on. And there's a greater recognition of this now. The fourth issue is the issue around training and capacity building and having the resources. And Carol, we're really looking forward to seeing your toolkit on sexual harassment, because those practical resources for negotiators, for workers, to identify, how do we identify sexual harassment when there's silence in the workplace? How can we make it safe for women to speak out about it? As Will had mentioned in Australia, that you had built in the voices of women into that work, and in Nepal. I think also in relation to the capacity building, it really is about, and I suppose this is the kind of, that related to this, is how we build the strategies of men as allies in the trade union movement. And I was really inspired by many of the campaigns for Convention 190, but also about men taking their role in campaigning for an end to gender-based violence and harassment. So very quick sum up, because we are coming to the end here. And I know that I want to pass the floor to Jordania before we finish. But if I could sum up one thing that, is very clear about this work, one thing that's absolutely fundamental to it, it's women's leadership. And if women are not present in leadership positions, those issues are not going to be coming to the foreground. That's why we have our campaigns on gender-based violence. It's because women have taken those leadership roles to say, this is a crucial, central issue in the workplace, and we need to address it. So I just want to very briefly thank all of our panelists. I'm sorry that Rita wasn't able to join us, but to say to our panelists, you're doing the most fantastic, inspiring work. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, particularly early in the morning, late at night, in the middle of the night, across the world. It's been a fantastic panel. Great to hear about your experiences, your learning, what your tips are for other trade unions. And thanks very much also to Iram and to Carmen for all the work that you've been doing on this, and also for the support you give to the trade unions across the world. So now I'm passing back to Jordania. Thank you.
Sí, ¿me escuchan? ¿Se escucha? Yes. Ok, pues primero reiterar desde la CCI, que como saben es una organización que representa alrededor de 200 millones de trabajadores y trabajadoras, nuestra intención de seguir fortaleciendo, como decías, Jen, el liderazgo de las mujeres. Es parte de nuestros programas de acción, de nuestra agenda de trabajo, porque sabemos cuál es la importancia de estar en los diferentes espacios donde se negocia colectivamente y donde se construyen políticas en favor del género, y por supuesto que tienen que ver con este flagelo de la violencia. Decirles también que, como en un momento también mencionabas, la violencia, el tema de la violencia de género es un tema de todos y todas, y ese fue el enfoque que le dimos desde la CCI. Dijimos, esto no es un problema de mujeres, aquí tiene que involucrarse todo el movimiento sindical, y así logramos construir esta herramienta tan importante que es el convenio 190 y su recomendación 206, porque se asumió esta bandera desde el movimiento sindical y poniendo el enfoque obviamente en esa violencia de género que vemos, vivimos constantemente y que sabemos que hay que tomar acción para erradicarla y eliminarla. Por otro lado, decir que no puede haber igualdad con la violencia de por medio. Es un obstáculo bastante fuerte y bastante grande, y así hay que verlo y así hay que seguirlo colocando en todas las mesas de discusión cuando vayamos a hablar de igualdad, cuando vayamos a hablar de democracia y de participación de las mujeres en los diferentes espacios. Hay que hablar de la relevancia que tiene o el impacto que tiene en las mujeres el tema de la violencia y las diferentes características que tiene la violencia, como se ha mencionado aquí. Seguir haciendo esfuerzos por el análisis de las causas, por ver cómo el tema de la discriminación también impacta los roles que nos asigna la sociedad, esa desigualdad de roles que vemos y que también afecta en términos de violencia y que es parte de las causas, pues hay que seguir haciendo las reflexiones al respecto. Y ahí, por último, decir que estamos reflexionando sobre esto, es cierto, y es importante que lo vayamos a hacer, pero siempre decimos que estas reflexiones tienen que llevarnos a una acción, tienen que llevarnos a generar más resultados de los que tenemos hasta el momento, siempre reconociendo la labor de las mujeres del movimiento sindical que hemos logrado, pues, llegar a este convenio, a esta recomendación y a la acción de muchas en el mundo, incluso a nivel nacional, con leyes nacionales, hemos llegado a incidir a través del convenio o de otras construcciones desde el movimiento sindical para que la realidad de la eliminación de la violencia pues se materialice. Agradecer muchísimo a todas las panelistas, a Valentina, una lástima yo también decir que Rita no pudo conectarse, a Esmerit Lama, no sé si lo dije bien en la pronunciación, a Janet, a Carol y por supuesto a ti, Jen, por la coordinación. Gracias a Carmen, a Irene por su trabajo y sus esfuerzos y muchísimas gracias a nuestras traductoras, traductores que han estado acompañando este evento y por supuesto a nuestras participantes que también hay que reconocerles que en sus países, en sus organizaciones hacen un esfuerzo inmenso en nombre de la eliminación de la violencia y por la ratificación de este convenio 190, que es una tarea asumida nuestra y que por supuesto vamos a seguir impulsando en todo el sentido y con todo el apoyo pleno de nuestra Confederación Sindical Internacional. Muchísimas gracias, compañeras, y no sé si hay algún compañero, creo que sí, por todos los aportes, por estar y por esta actividad. Seguimos en lucha y estamos juntas y juntos en todo.